Okay, guys, what I'm going to go over today is I'm going to go over the organization of the body, and then ultimately start talking to you about the cells of the body. The cells are really important because that's the functional unit of the body. All of our organs, all of our tissues are made up of individual cells, and the cell is the simplest form of life. It can produce all of the requirements necessary for life. But to understand that, a couple of things we got to go over. First of all, yet in chemistry you learned that stuff, regardless of the stuff, they're made up of these small units called atoms. So if you take atoms and you put them together, you make molecules. So we talked about this. Examples of molecules, in this case organic molecules, right? Atoms chemically bonded together, right? You got your carbs, your fat, and your amino acids, right? And the amino acids we talked about, if you chemically bond those together in a specific order, you can form proteins. And the proteins really are the important guys. They're the structural functional proteins. The functional proteins are your enzymes and hormones. And again, the enzymes control all the chemical reactions inside your body. So they make all of the things that you're doing right now happening. Thinking a thought, singing a song, moving a muscle. And inside each cell type, in each unique cell type, there are different enzymes. And that makes sense, right? Because different cells do different things. And in order to perform those different chemical reactions, they have to have different enzymes inside them. And we learned that those enzymes are made up of individual amino acids chemically bonded together. We also learned that the shape of the enzyme determines its function. So if you alter the shape of an enzyme, it won't be able to do its function. And for most enzymes of the body, they're temperature and pH sensitive, and they maintain their ideal shape and therefore their best function at 98.6 body temperature and a pH of 7.35 to 7.45. So you also can take these individual organic compounds, so you can take carbs, fats, and proteins, and you can put those guys together. You can form big molecules or macromolecules. So the body will do that. And in this case, it can form macromolecules, big compounds. And the big compounds that you got to kind of familiarize yourself with are combinations of carbs, fats, proteins, and also inorganic molecules can combine with organic molecules and form these macromolecules, and they're really, really important. This is the beginnings of life. So because we're all made up of cells, if you take a lipid, fat, and you combined it with a phosphate, you can form phospholipid. And that phospholipid makes up the cell membrane. The cell membrane is the barrier between basically the blood and the stuff inside the cell. And how it works is this. You have a phosphate head which likes water, right? It attracts water. and then connected to that phosphate head are two lipid tails. And what's interesting is if you look at the cell membrane, then this would be the stuff inside the cell, intracellular. And the cell membrane separates what's inside the cell from essentially the blood. And every living cell, at least in this case, has to have a capillary that supplies it with the stuff that that cell needs. So whoever thunked this up really had it going on, because in this world, you're either water soluble or fat soluble, right? So you have this water soluble phosphate head connected to this lipid tail, and it faces the outside, the blood. Then you have another phosphate head connected to a lipid tail, and then you make a sandwich. You sandwich this phospholipid. So you have the inner portion, which is fat or water-hating, hydrophobic, and then you have the phosphate heads that like water. So what this does is this sets up a barrier to protect the stuff that's inside the cell from the stuff that is outside the cell. Now, a cell membrane is made up of other macromolecules. If you take a carb and you combined it with a protein, you will make what's called a glycoprotein. Now, this is important. There's stuff in the blood. At this point right now, who cares what stuff it is, right? There's X, there's Y, there's Z, stuff in the blood. And everything that's in the blood, you don't want it to affect every cell. It wouldn't make sense, because then cells wouldn't be specialized. So glycoproteins are proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. So they have the protein portion, and then they have the carb portion here. And what these do, these glycoproteins, act as cell receptors. So what this does is, these cell receptors, is it allows chemicals from the blood to affect this cell. Who cares what cell it is right now? And let's say that chemical Z binds to this specific receptor. This chemical can bind to that receptor. And when it binds to that receptor, this receptor then tells the cell to do something. Who cares what it is right now? Just understand that these receptors are important because they allow chemicals from the blood to influence what that cell is going to do. And this is important because it prevents the chemical from getting into the cell and potentially doing bad stuff. So it's like this chemical is a messenger, and it sends a message to the receptor, and then the receptor, which is built into that cell membrane, will tell the cell to do something. Now, because different cells do different things, they're going to have different types of receptors embedded in their cell membrane. And this is perfect. And clinically, this has profound implications. It's profound. Because many drugs work by either stimulating a receptor or blocking a receptor. And that's a fact. So to understand pharmacology, you have to understand this receptor deal stuff. So again, most receptors found in the cells that are embedded within the cell membrane, this fat and phosphate, are glycoproteins. Then you can take a carb, and you can combine it with a lipid. And you can make what's called a glycolipid. Now, glycolipids can also be used as cell membranes, but they're also part of mucus, other portions of the cell. My point is that we're just not made of carbs, fats, and proteins. We're made of combinations of those things. And those combinations of organic compounds and organic and inorganic compounds make up the living unit that is you, and that is the cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane, very important, critical. Your cell membrane breaks, ruptures, that cell, it's over for the cell. But these macromolecules that are in the cell, they can form smaller structures, portions of the cell that have a specific function. I'll go over more of this in more detail in a little bit. Let me give you an example. So look, you have the cell membrane here, right? Not shown in this lovely diagram that I ripped off from the internet is the capillary that supplies the stuff that that cell needs in order to do what it does. So embedded in the cell membrane are these little receptors. And what's really important to understand is that the shape of the receptor and the type of receptor that's embedded in the cell membrane determines which chemical can affect that cell. So when a chemical from the blood wants to exert itself, wants to cause this particular cell to do something, it has to bind to a specific receptor. If the cell doesn't have that specific receptor, then this particular chemical can't do anything to that particular cell. So that's how cells are able to maintain their function, specific function, and how chemicals from the blood can exert their effects. So embedded in or inside the protective coating, that cell membrane, that phospholipid bilayer, are portions of the cell that perform a particular function. Now, almost all cells of the body have a nucleus, and the nucleus is surrounded by a protective envelope called the nuclear envelope. The nuclear envelope protects what's in the nucleus from any potential chemicals in the cytoplasm of the cells. The cytoplasm is the watery part of the cell, the soup of the cell. If you look at the cell, it kind of looks like a bowl of soup, right? You got the watery part, and then you got some noodles and some folded noodles. So the cytoplasm is the watery part of the cell. So the nucleus of the cell is the control center of the cell. And inside the nucleus is this organic compound made up of these building blocks called nucleic acids. And nucleic acids, chemically bonded together, build the molecule of DNA. And DNA is referred to as the heredity molecule. So this is where you get your eye color, your hair color, how tall you is, how smart you is, right? And if you chemically bond nucleic acids together, you will form this big molecule of DNA. What I want you to understand is, remember, what What performs all the chemical reactions inside a cell? Enzymes. So the DNA tells your cells how to put together amino acids. How you put those amino acids together, the sequence and the type of amino acid that you chemically bond together, right, determines the protein shape and therefore its function. What inside the cell tells you how to put together those amino acids? The DNA. The DNA, you don't want to damage your DNA. You damage your DNA, you have what's called a genetic mutation. And if the DNA is damaged, then how you put together the amino acids is going to be messed up. And if you mess up the sequence of amino acids, when those amino acids, because they carry an electrical charge, if you recall, positive, negative, positive, right? I'm making this up. When those charges interact, that is going to determine its shape. And the shape of a protein, in this case enzymes, determine its function. So if you alter the shape of an enzyme by altering the sequence of amino acids, it won't be able to do its job. I explained to you that hemoglobin inside a red blood cell is a big protein. And in some people, they're missing one amino acid in that huge string of amino acids that make up that big molecule hemoglobin. And because one amino acid is missing, when the charges interact, instead of having a nice round red blood cell, right? You got this nice round red blood cell. In people with sickle cell, when all the amino acids interact and they bend and twist, they form a sickled red blood cell. So these things are important. And again, what holds the code to how to put together all the proteins in the body? The DNA. Where is the DNA located? It's located in the nucleus of the cell, and it's protected, further protected, by the nuclear envelope. So only certain things are allowed to enter the nucleus of the cell. And again, that makes sense, perfect sense, because you don't want chemicals that are inside the cell just willy-nilly going into the nucleus, because they can potentially damage the DNA. So where do you get the code to put together your proteins? You get the code from DNA. Now, what do we eat? We eat aminal, fat, carbs, protein, and plant carbs, fats, carbs, and protein. So what we have to do is we have to break down that hamburger and that salad into its constituents, which are carbs, fats, and protein. And then what we do is we take those carbs, fats, and protein, and we put them together inside the cell to make people carbs, people fats, people protein. And we also take those people carbs, people fat, and people protein and put them together to form glycoproteins, glycolipids, lipoproteins, and phospholipids. So the stuff that we eat ultimately goes to building and maintaining our cells. And again, it's perfect. So, real quick, where did you get the code to build a particular protein inside a cell? You got it from the DNA. Where do you physically put together the protein inside a cell? Well, you have this little noodle dish, this folded membrane. And embedded in this folded membrane are these little spherical things called ribosomes. So Ribosomes are the actual workbench. This is where you put together the amino acids to build your protein. The ribosomes hold the amino acids together as you're stringing them along. The place where you do it, where the ribosomes are located, that foldy membrane is called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Sounds like a monster movie. The reason it's rough is when you look under it under a microscope, you can see these little ribosomes, and it gives it its rough appearance. That's why it's called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So inside a cell, where do you put together the proteins? You put them together, you chemically bond those amino acids in the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Now, we're not just protein, right? We're carbs and fat. So in this portion here, this portion of the endoplasmic reticulum doesn't have any ribosomes. So this is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum is where you make people lipid, people fat. Also, you store electrolytes. So what's the function of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum? To store electrolytes and to make people lipid. So we got the protein, we got the lipid. Then you have this other folded, kind of smashed membrane, and that's called the Golgi apparatus. The Golgi apparatus makes people carbs, but the other thing that the Golgi apparatus does, it's kind of like the Federal Express of the cell. So what happens? Where do you make the protein inside the cell? The rough endoplasmic reticulum. Where do you make the lipid? The smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Where do you make the carbs? The Golgi apparatus. So what the Golgi apparatus also does is it's the final packaging area, the staging area for cell product. So let's say, for example, and I'm making this up, this guy right here is a liver cell. I'm making this up. So if the liver cell produces cholesterol. So if you need cholesterol, what's going to happen is the DNA is going to signal, hey, let's build some cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipoprotein. That lipoprotein is made up of fat and protein. So the DNA is going to signal the rough endoplasmic reticulum to begin to build the protein portion of that lipoprotein. Then you make the fat portion in the smooth. And then the protein from the rough and the lipid from the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, right? They go to the Golgi apparatus where they're chemically combined to form a lipoprotein. Then you have this lipoprotein that's made in the Golgi apparatus. I'll put LP. And then the Golgi apparatus takes part of its own membrane and wraps it around that lipoprotein. This membrane that wraps up the lipoprotein is called a secretory vesicle. So it packages it up, and then that secretory vesicle, small one shown right here, binds to the cell membrane. So in this case, this one storing that cholesterol binds to the cell membrane. It actually melds with it, and then it dumps that cholesterol, that lipoprotein, into the blood. So a secretory vesicle is part of the Golgi apparatus and it is used to transport cell product. And that is the function of the rough, the smooth, and the Golgi. So the Golgi makes people carbs, and it is the final staging area for cellular product. It then pinches off a piece of that membrane, the Golgi membrane. That secretory vesicle then binds to the cell membrane and then squirts that cholesterol into the blood. Let me show you. So let me set this up for you. All right, here's the cell membrane, right? And then over here is the blood. Here's the secretory vesicle, and here's the stuff that we got to get out of the cell and into the blood. So what the secretory vesicle will do is it will bind to the cell membrane and actually fuse with it. So you add a little extra cell membrane when this happens, and it will dump its product into the blood. And the function, the organelle that's responsible for exporting that is the Golgi apparatus. Now, this cell that we have right here is referred to as a composite cell. A composite cell is a cell that has all the different types of features found in individual cells all wrapped up into one. Let me explain that even more. What that means is this: not every cell has a flagellum. Not every cell has microvilli. Not every cell has cilia. So this composite cell has all the features found in different types of cells all into one. And I'm going to go through each part and explain it to you. So let's start here with the mitochondria. The mitochondria, or mitochondrion singular, mitochondria plural, this is where you make cellular energy. So if you read in your book, cellular energy is created aerobically, meaning you need oxygen in the mitochondria. And that's where you make ATP aerobically. Now, the unique thing about mitochondria is they have their own DNA. So that means this individual cell, if it was required to make more ATP aerobically, these mitochondria have the ability to divide and make more mitochondria. So in muscle cells, this is how people become good endurance runners. When you're running and you're stressing those muscles, that will signal the mitochondria to divide and make more of them. That means that you can make more ATP aerobically. So if you're a marathon runner, you're basically a human mitochondria. So again, the mitochondria make ATP aerobically. And where do you get the energy to make the, or where do you get the fuel to make the cellular energy? You get it from the food we eat. So The mitochondria can break down fat, carbs, or protein, amino acids, and it can break the chemical bonds that hold those things together. And when you break chemical bonds, you release energy. And then the cells capture that energy in the form of this molecule. This molecule is a molecule of adenosine. And then connected to that adenosine molecule are 3 phosphates. This is called adenosine 1Z, 2Z, triZ phosphate, and it's abbreviated ATP. And where do you make ATP aerobically, meaning requiring oxygen? Is in the mitochondria. That's the function of the mitochondria. Now, some cells of your body are involved in absorbing stuff into the blood. So let me ask you a question, and you'll get this. Which has more surface area? A or 2? And assuming that I make these the same length, which has more surface area? A does. Because if you were to pull A out and flatten it out just like 2, right, it would be longer. So in parts of the body that require you to absorb stuff into the blood, you have these extensions of the cell membrane called microvilli. So microvilli are extensions of the cell membrane that increase the ability to absorb stuff into the blood. And they do this by increasing the surface area for absorption. And the places that you find microvilli would be pretty logical, right? You would find these guys, microvilli, in the lining of the intestines, right? You got to break down your food with your digestive enzymes, and then you got to get that food from your digestive tract into the blood. So in the intestines, and specifically the small intestines, that's where you find a ton of microvilli. Let me just show you this real quick. If you have ever seen a person with Crohn's disease, Crohn's disease is where the immune system didn't get the message that the lining of your GI tract is good for you, and it will destroy it and replace it with scar tissue. Scar tissue doesn't absorb stuff, right? All it is scar tissue. So a person with Crohn's disease is not going to be able to digest and absorb food. So a person with Crohn's disease tends to be really, really skinny. Even though they're eating, if you can't digest it and absorb it into the blood, you can't gain calories. So this is the normal lining of an intestine, and this is the lining of an intestine with Crohn's disease. And you can see this is all scar tissue. And because scar tissue doesn't work well and it doesn't have the ability to fight off infection, a lot of times these people with Crohn's disease get infections in their GI tract, so they have to have their intestines removed. So that is microvilli. Now, another unique feature found in particular cells is cilia. Whoops. Cilia. And cilia are extensions of the cell membrane, and these actually beat. They move. So where you find cilia is in the lining of the respiratory tract. So watch. You are talking to somebody. I don't know, say, this class stinks. I don't like it. And every once in a while, you got to swallow the goob that was in the back of your throat. That's the function of cilia. So let me show you. So in the lining of the respiratory tract, you have these specialized cells that have extensions of the cell membrane. These guys right here are cilia. And cilia beat in one direction. They beat from the lower airway, the lower parts of your lungs, to the upper airway, and then ultimately to the back of your throat. So cilia help clean your lungs. So you have these cells that are ciliated, and then about every fifth or sixth cell in the lining that makes up your respiratory tract, you have these cells called goblet cells. Gobble, gobble. And goblet cells secrete mucus. And mucus boogers are sticky. So when you breathe stuff that's bad in the air, which there is bad stuff in the air, the mucus catches that bad stuff, and then the cilia beat it from the lower airway to the upper airway. And you get that goob in the back of your throat that you swallow, or you hack it out, which is, not pleasant. Anyways, one of the things that cigarette smoking does, smoking cigarettes, it paralyzes the cilia. So you still secrete mucus. As a matter of fact, you secrete more mucus than normal, but the cilia doesn't move it. That's why smoking long term these people end up with a really bad cough. The only way to clean their lungs is to plunge their lungs, and you plunge your lungs by coughing. So that's one place that cilia is found. In the lining of the respiratory tract, and its purpose is to move that mucus blanket created by those goblet cells so that you can clean your lungs. You also find cilia in the reproductive tract. And where you find them, and this is what's referred to as empirical data, data that you should just know through experience, that you have the female gonads, which are the ovaries, and they release the egg. The fallopian tubes are not directly connected to the ovaries. So as you can see, you got these little fingers on here, but on those fingers you have cilia. So when the egg pops out of the ovary, the cilia will start to beat to draw that egg into the fallopian tube. So the ovary pops out the egg, and then the cilia start beating and saying, "Come here, Herman, come here." So this is why, because the fallopian tubes and the ovaries are not directly connected, sometimes an egg that is ovulated will lodge and start developing a baby after it's been fertilized by sperm. It may lodge on a part of the colon, the intestine, and then the baby will start growing there. That's called an ectopic pregnancy. So cilia are found in the lining of the lungs and at the ends of fallopian tubes to draw that egg into the fallopian tube. All right. Okay, we're doing good. All right. Now, you also have some structural proteins in the cells themselves. The structural proteins that help determine the cell shape and therefore kind of its function and how they're arranged determines their shape are these guys called, microtubules. So microtubules are structural proteins that make up the cell's framework. They form the framework of the cell. And how those microtubules are arranged determines the cell's shape. Now, you have an extension of a cell that can actually move. It has rotary action. That's the flagellum, and you find that in sperm. And the core of the flagellum is made up of microtubules that are arranged in a cylinder. And these microtubules will actually rotate. And that rotation of the microtubules is what causes the whipping action of the flagellum to propel the sperm. Now, remember that proteins, any type of protein, is temperature and pH sensitive. So this is why males have a scrotal sac. Sperm is generated in the testes, and when sperm is generated, you have the flagellum, and it's made of protein. So if the protein is brought, if the scrotal sac is brought up towards the core, or in the testes have not descended into the scrotal sac, they're exposed to a higher than normal temperature. And that temperature can change the shape of these microtubules, these proteins, and it won't allow the sperm to swim. So this gentleman, if that happens to them, they can become infertile or sterile. So if you go to an infertility clinic because you can't have a baby, one of the first questions the infertility doctor will ask the guy is, do you wear boxers or tighty-whities? If you wear tighty-whities, they tend to pull the scrotal sac towards the core of the body, warming up the sperm and then changing the shape of those microtubules that make up that sperm. So the result is they don't swim so good. So sometimes it's just a real simple case of wearing boxers for a while, and then you can have a baby. So that's microtubules, flagellum. Basal body, the basal body is the production site of microtubules, so that's where they're produced. And then you have these guys here, called the centrioles. The centrioles, right here, these are only active when the cells divide. So these help with cell division. And in this case, that's really all I want you to know. Because in the advanced class, I'll go more into that. So the centrioles work or active when cells are actively dividing. So let's clean up some of this stuff. All right, let's now go back a little bit to the nucleus. A couple of things, right? The nucleolus is where you make ribosomes. chromatin is unraveled DNA. So if you look, watch. DNA is this huge big molecule that's made up of these nucleic acids. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Huge big molecule. And the cell does what you would do. If you're going to move, you pack up the stuff, you put it in boxes, and you label it. So when a cell is going to divide, it has this long strand of DNA, and that's not really easy to move. So when a cell is going to divide, it takes this long strand of DNA called chromatin. So chromatin is long strands of DNA. And then it packs it up nice and neat into these things called chromosomes. So chromosomes are packaged DNA. And human beings have 23 pairs of chromosomes. You get one pair from your mom and one pair from the milkman or your dad. Just playing. And each one of those chromosomes is homologous. That's a fancy way of saying that they match up. So the chromosome that you got, the DNA that you got from your mom that determines your hair color, the chromosome matches up that DNA from your dad. So you get a segment of DNA from your mom and a segment of DNA from your dad. And when they're packaged into chromosomes, the segment of DNA from your mom is here and the segment of DNA from your dad is here. So it organizes the DNA so when the cell divides, those chromosomes go with it. It's a good idea. So this is the other thing. In DNA, and this is really important, a section of DNA that tells the cell how to put together a protein is called a gene. A section of DNA that tells the cell how to put together a specific protein is called a gene. And there are over 25,000 individual genes that make up the human genome, the entire strand of DNA. Now, this is really important. Every cell that has a nucleus contains all the genes to make all the proteins in the body. So if you watch the original Jurassic Park, right, how the mosquito sucked out some of the blood from the dinosaur, a white blood cell, because it can divide, has all the genetic information to make all the proteins in that dinosaur. So that's why you only need one cell to determine the genetic makeup of an individual. So on Maury and Who's Your Baby's Daddy, they don't need a sperm sample from the guy. All they do is take a skin cell, they swab the inside of the cheek, and skin cells divide. Therefore, they have DNA in their nucleus, and they have all the DNA that is needed to make every single protein inside your body. That's why, you know, on these crime shows, all you need is one cell, and if you can get that DNA, then you can match it up. And know this, and we're all in it together, people, 99.1% of all human DNA is identical. It is only that 0.9% that differs. And when they look at Maury and Who's Your Baby's Daddy, that is the section of DNA that they look at to determine if that guy is the father. And because each set of DNA, except for identical twins, is unique, the odds of someone having that same section of DNA of another person is infinitesimal. It ain't going to happen. So that's why DNA is used to solve a lot of crimes, or in some cases to acquit people of crimes, because it just ain't possible. Whoever DNA was there did the deed. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the human cell with its various components found in different cell types. And that's what I'm expecting for that question, to label the composite cell and give a brief description of each part of the cell. Oh, one thing I forgot. Sorry. Look, bad stuff can get into a cell. Yeah? So inside your cells, you have this little custodial service called lysosomes. Lysosomes are kind of like the garbage man of the cell. They go around and they clean up cellular debris. So they gobble it up and get rid of it. All right, I think I did it, and that's that. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the basic structure of a human cell and the individual organelles and their basic function. And I want the whole thing explained to me just like I explained it to you. All right? Good luck.